Hi, I'm Christina. I'm from BookPeople, and I'm the Events and Marketing Manager. I want to welcome you all for our event with Lawrence Wright and Nicholas Kristof. I hope you're all ready for a very interesting conversation. I want to thank you for being here and for supporting us through these ever-changing times. It really means a lot to us. We're really just happy to keep in touch with you and just keep doing what we love. That said, I'd like to welcome Lawrence Wright, staff writer for The New Yorker, a playwright, screenwriter, and the author of 10 books of nonfiction, including The Looming Tower, Going Clear, and God Save Texas, and one previous novel, God's Favorite. His book has received many honors, including a Pulitzer Prize for The Looming Tower. He and his wife are longtime residents of Austin, Texas, and very loved by the BookPeople family. Nicholas Kristof has co-authored several books with his wife, Cheryl Wooden, including A Path Appears and Half the Sky. Together, they were awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1990 for their coverage of China. They also received the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for the Lifetime Achievement in 2009. Now an up-at columnist for the New York Times, Kristof was previously bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He won a second Pulitzer in 2006 for his column on Darfur. And with that, I'd like to welcome Lawrence Wright and Nicholas Kristof. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.
Thanks, Christina. And I should say that I'm a longtime fan of Larry and his work, and also a fan of this book. And you're in for a treat when you read it. But Larry, let me just start off by saying, it's sort of strange, obviously, to begin a book tour as you are with this remote.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's incredibly in keeping with this book because, how else to begin to begin talking about a book about pandemics except in the middle of a pandemic?
Yeah. It's really weird. I mean, people ask me about it and I say, oh, it's very strange, but it is really strange. It's not anything I ever anticipated. I did think that we would be facing a big pandemic one day. I didn't know what day. And the fact that it is today is a total coincidence.
And so when early this year, when did you begin to talk to the publisher and say, hey, I've done a little research about the situation that we're headed for? When did you realize you were going to be publishing in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, the Chinese made their announcement on New Year's Eve, if you remember. And I was alert because I remembered SARS and how it had begun in China, and they had hid it, they had information for some time. And it's a miracle of public health that they were able to stop that contagion within 100 days. Just totally amazing. But here was another one. And so I thought this could be a problem. As it got close to February, I began to get nervous because I thought we're not going to be able to contain this. It got into Europe. It was definitely going to come to America, despite what some of our authorities were saying. Viruses just don't respect national boundaries. And so I knew it would wind up here and soon.
And so over the last, month or two, as you've been watching politics and watching stores sell out of toilet paper, watching the stock market dip for a while, have you been nodding with familiarity? And I mean, there are obviously enormous echoes in what is happening in the real world with what you wrote about.
Well, sometimes, Nick, I feel like when I pick up the paper, I'm reading the next chapter in my book. And it's, honestly, I'd like for the coincidences to stop because the book is pretty dark. And, I don't want it to go as far as I took it, but it is really spooky sometimes, the things that were just lucky guesses. But for the most part, the reason that things in real life are playing out as they did very much in the novel is I talked to experts and they told me what would happen. And not only did I talk, they had done tabletop exercises almost every year, Johns Hopkins and elsewhere, gaming, what would happen if, the same question that I asked. And so it's not just my novel, it's in all those studies. It's in the briefing books that were handed off to the administration. All the details that I gleaned from that are so resonant with what's happening right now, people knew. People knew. The experts knew.
And as you say, the novel is indeed pretty dark. And now there are plenty of American politicians who say that, well, you know, the light is at the end of the tunnel. We're almost there. Vice President Pence says that by Memorial Day, we'll be, you know, mostly through this. We'll have this mostly behind us. In your book, you actually, there is this respite. It comes, and then there's this period of calm. How do you feel about the road ahead?
My flu, the one I invented, was built on the 1918 flu. I actually made a calendar on my computer, and it happened to be the year 2020, just a coincidence. But I decided to take the events that took place in the year 1918 and put them, you know, that was the template underneath all the events in the novel were things that actually happened 100 years ago. So the question I had for these experts was, what would happen if it happened now? Would we be any better prepared than our ancestors? And so the 1918 flu really manifested itself in February, March 1918. It was a killer, but it wasn't, it wasn't as savage as it became. Part of the reason it was so dangerous, it took root among the soldiers in their camps and on the troop ships and stuff like that going to war. And so it was very dangerous, and but over the summer it mutated. Yes, it died down, but when it came back in the fall, October was the deadliest month in American history. Now, I'm not forecasting that would happen. The 1918 contagion was an influenza. Influenza is still the great killer, but this is a coronavirus. It's different. Experts are looking at the influenza thinking that this could easily happen with coronavirus, or it could just simply linger here until it's infected enough people that it stops. We don't really know. It could with us, like the flu, it could recur every year. But there's so many things about this virus we don't know. Every day there's something new that we're learning.
In 1918, during the Spanish flu, and in your book, the problems are in some ways magnified by politicians mishandling them. So famously in 1918 in Philadelphia, the parade in September. In your book, many examples of politicians not paying attention to science, right, and really trying to find a political way out. So as you look at the world's handling, and maybe particularly America's handling of this coronavirus, how do we do?
It's pretty dismaying, isn't it? The absence of leadership is really dire. And this is among the states, there's a great variety of leadership. And, some are doing terribly and some are doing very well. And they each have different situations. And even the cities are different. But you take that up to the next level, and then you have the federal response, which has been extremely weak and vacillating and confused. And I think dangerous in the sense that many lives have been lost that might not have been had the government taken control early on. And then at the international level, there's also a great deal of confusion. Every state, every country, every state, every city seems to be improvising. And we're all trying to come up with a solution, but the absence of leadership at every level is very striking.
Larry, one of the things that I admire about you and that I'm jealous of is your versatility. And, you do nonfiction, you do fiction, you do books and magazine articles and TV, film, plays. This actually started not as a novel, it started it has kind of an unusual origin story. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, 10 years ago, Ridley Scott, the filmmaker, he had read the Cormac McCarthy novel, The Road, which is a post-apocalyptic novel about a father and a son, wandering through the ruins of a civilization. And Ridley just had the question, what happened? force or event caused civilization to crumble. And I was interested in that idea. And I thought maybe a nuclear war or something like that. But honestly, I had done some stories about diseases when I was a young reporter living in Atlanta, and the Center for Disease Control was there. And I got very intrigued by public health. This was long ago, but it was, I remember being so entranced by the ingenuity and the courage of those people that I met, and who were in, you know, the microbiologists, the epidemiologists. There were so many interesting people. And it occurred to me that was an opportunity to visit that world. And I think one other thing, as a novelist and a screenwriter, it's hard to find heroes today. You know, we're not living in a particularly heroic era, but in the world of public health, they're everywhere. And I felt no scruples about making a hero in that world.
And you could have addressed this issue, obviously, in nonfiction. You do obviously much more nonfiction than fiction. Why did you decide to make this a novel?
I don't know. I think that there's, you know, as a reporter, normally what we do, we go out and ask what happened. And, but in this case, the question was, what could happen? And it's not that big a leap, Nick. I mean, you know, using the same techniques, going out and talking to experts, doing research, reading books and stuff like that, it's the same process. But it allowed me to imagine a world, one very similar to the one we're in. But I did feel some sense of alarm when I talked to the experts about what might happen. And they had spent their entire career thinking about what would happen if 1918 came back. And so it hadn't yet, but I thought a novel would be a great way to express the sense of foreboding that I found when I talked to my experts.
One of those in our audience here, whom we can't see, Kim, asks about October. Why, you know, why October? And actually, I wondered whether that was a reference in some way to the threat from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the world, and it's supposed to, you know, conjure that to some degree.
Well, that's interesting. I guess the title has more resonance than I gave it credit for. For me, the reference to October is when it all goes to hell. And, you know, the second wave arrives, and, you know, there are things that we don't see that happen in October, but we know that October marks the moment when it all comes to a climax.
And Kim also asks that as you were doing your research, did you find yourself getting more germ conscious and washing your hands more often?
Honestly, no. You know, I'm not a germaphobe, but now I do. You know, I'm a good citizen in that front, but at the time I was not thinking exactly. I was still locked up in, this was a world in my imagination, not one that was outside my house.
I don't want to exactly go through the plot of the book, but it begins in Indonesia, or the early crucial scene is Indonesia, where the epidemic is seen, and then there's a chance to contain it, and then one of the characters goes on the Hajj to Mecca, and as it happens, there is now a discussion about whether the Hajj this year should be canceled precisely to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. And you know, your book certainly illuminates that. Do you have any, you know, thoughts about whether the Hajj, maybe this isn't the ideal year for the Hajj?
You know, after 9/11, when I was working on the looming tower, I lived in Saudi Arabia. They wouldn't let me in as a reporter, but I became an expat worker. My job was mentoring young reporters at this newspaper in Jeddah, which is bin Laden's hometown. And one of my first tasks was to supervise their coverage of the Hajj. And of course, I couldn't go to Mecca myself, but I was constantly in contact with my reporters. And one thing I learned is that every year there are epidemics, oftentimes of very serious diseases. And you have 2 or 3 million people gathered in a spot like that, and then they all get on planes and fly home. I thought, this is a disaster in the making. And so that thought always lingered in my mind, was a what if one of these diseases took root in Mecca or any other big religious pilgrimage, like at home, earlier this year, or in India. There are many other instances where you have pilgrims gather and closely pressed together, coming from many parts of the world. From a public health point of view, it's a pretty dangerous situation.
You and I both have spent a fair part of our careers writing about international security threats in a more conventional sense, about terrorism, for example. And I know that over the years, my own conception of international security threats has changed and become broader to include things like drug trafficking, climate change, and indeed pandemics. And I wondered if indeed you see, a common thread from your writing about the threat from Al-Qaeda to the threat from pandemics today.
I sure do, Nick. Thank you for asking me that. First of all, the effects, the attempt by some terrorist groups to kill as many people as possible, pandemics do a wonderful job of that. There are groups like Al-Qaeda and Aum Shinrikyo, for instance, the Japanese cult. They were definitely seeking weapons of mass destruction, and they experimented with biological weapons. There are white supremacist groups that are doing the same right now. So yes, terrorism and biowarfare have a common ground. And, as all those things you cited, climate change, Houston from Hurricane Harvey suffered far more damage than an ordinary terrorist could do. But those kinds of things, the problem is similar: vast destructions of society and the death of a lot of people. Terrorism aspires to that. Nature sometimes responds that way to our own behavior. And they're all very similar forms of experience. And we have to adjust to the fact, especially, that I think pandemics will be coming our way increasingly. The pace has picked up. Since the turn of the century, we've had SARS, MERS, Zika, West Nile, Asian flu, just one thing after another, Ebola, all these novel viruses, and any one of them could be a real killer. We've been in some ways fortunate, but there will be a bigger challenge in our future, I fear.
The hero of the book is somebody who goes around trying to put out these global disease fires, and there indeed are, as you know, a lot of such people around the world. Most recently, a lot of them have been wrestling with Ebola in Congo, for example. And I wonder if if you do indeed see them as kind of heroes in real life.
Oh, I sure do. I just admire these people so much. For one thing, there's a big swath of experts that we can talk about. Just the people in the labs. The kind of ingenuity that's required to try to understand a virus like this one that we're facing right now, that is so complicated and tricky. But I guess I'm particularly drawn to the epidemiologists who actually go out in the field and face something like Ebola, a brand new virus that kills people in the most awful ways. And to me, it's totally terrifying, far more terrifying than going to a war, for instance. Just the idea that there's some presence around you, that is, some germs in the air or something like that, and you have no idea if you're infected until you're sick. And healthcare workers are always the first people to get sick. And they're the ones that die the most frequently, just as in the current situation. So yes, my admiration is unbounded for those people.
Um, we have a question from John, who he listened to the first hour on the audiobook and says it's totally engrossing. He's learning tons. He notes that in the beginning of the book, the Indonesians are trying to cover it up, or trying to cover up what happens, and notes the similarity with what China was initially doing in the first 3 weeks of January in Wuhan. And he asks, can you talk a little bit more about the kind of global cooperation that is required to address this kind of challenge?
Well, that's a good question. This disease is not something that can be solved at a national level. It's an international problem because it just literally flies across the borders, and you need to have an international response. Unfortunately, there are some countries that have in the past withheld cooperation from international authorities. China was particularly guilty of that in the first SARS outbreak. But Indonesia's had a problem with that too, and that's why I chose Indonesia as the locale for the origin of this. And there was an odd reaction in Indonesia during one of the outbreaks, which was they felt that scientists were exploiting a virus that belonged to Indonesia. In other words, it was like a national resource, and that they should gain a part of the patent money and stuff like that. It really led to an interesting argument, but that kind of infighting, while scientists are trying to figure out how to stop a killer virus, is very damaging. So we need, I'm for one would be much more in favor of awarding some authority to the World Health Organization. It's a supplicant. It has no authority at all. When China said you can't come in, they had no way of going in without that permission.
I'm totally with you on that point. I mean, I thought I did frankly think that they were a little bit too complimentary of China, but the idea of defunding them at this juncture just strikes me as completely crazy.
But World Health Organization is not a perfect organization, but it's the only one. It's what we have. And when the administration complains about it, we had our own eyes on the ground. The CDC had surveillance teams in dozens of countries around the world, and the funding cut required them to withdraw them. So we lost the eyes on the ground that we had in China, as well as many other countries.
That's right. Yep. And one of the things that you explore is the degree to which a public health challenge magnifies foreign relations challenges. And for example, the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and likewise between Russia and the US. And people seize upon the pandemic partly as an excuse, and partly because they see the world through a prism of paranoia and nationalism.
Right.
And I wonder if you have concerns about that happening this time. I mean, there are China-US relations are clearly more strained now. I wonder if you worry about how this may affect international relations today.
I do. I feel like the geopolitical fallout hasn't happened entirely yet, but the accusations, the blame that's going around, every great disease, I guess, carries with it a lot of stigma, blame, and shame. But this business of making accusations that the Chinese cooked it up in a lab, or vice versa, the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, and the Iranians are all saying that it was a bioweapon made by the US. These are very dangerous charges because they incite hatred. And once hatred gets rolling, it develops its own momentum, and it begins to shape national responses. So yes, I'm very worried about it. I would like to see these needless conflicts diminished in the face of a real challenge to humanity.
And Jerry asks, so how do you think we should handle China? they do have some culpability, but don't we need their help and cooperation to get out of this?
Yes, I totally agree that both of those statements. I think what we should do is fund the CDC so that we can put our own surveillance teams back there and cooperate with the Chinese scientists, and we might learn something from them. But at least we'd have people on the ground that could tell us what's going on, and we didn't in this instance.
There were, there are some people in this country who, whenever you ask them what's on their mind, then Bill Gates, for example, for years, he's talking about his nightmare about a big pandemic. Is that something that if I had run into you at a cocktail party a couple of years ago, would you have bent my ear about pandemics and the need for pandemic preparedness? Or was that just one of many things that you were sort of thinking about?
Well, I do worry about other things, but had you caught me at a party and like Ridley Scott posed the question, what do you think is the biggest threat? Pandemics would be high on my list. Whether it was one or two, I'm not sure, but I always had a feeling that we're vulnerable. And these budget cuts and things like that have only made us far more so.
Peter Hotez, who's a great international public health expert, he was telling me that we always have these wake-up calls, SARS, MERS, et cetera, and then we wake up and roll over and go back to sleep. And I wonder, I wonder if that's going to happen again. And what can we do? What would you like to see to build up surveillance capacity so that the next pandemic, this one is a coronavirus, but as your book suggests, maybe the thing people are worried about most has been another avian flu. And so what should we be doing if we actually wake up?
Well, Nick, I feel like as a society, we're at a crossroads. And, this is a profound moment in history. It's not the Black Death, but it is a severe experience, and it's going to have terrible financial consequences. It's going to be remembered. And when we've had challenges in the past, like the Great Depression, we completely reshaped our social fabric in order to save our country. We rose to the task. World War II, we conquered a formidable enemy, and we created the greatest manufacturing and commercial base the world's ever seen. So we rose to the task. And then 9/11. Once again, I remember so strongly the feeling that, we're going to have to stand for something now. We're going to have to be the America that our parents gave us. But what we did was invade Iraq. It was a colossal error. And, I look at Arab Spring, take it out of the context of America. I was so hopeful that, here's a region that's so dying to have democracy and needs reform, and yet it's only become more tyrannical. So, this is where we are. I think we have the opportunity. Everybody can see there's nothing like a pandemic or a depression or a war to expose the society you're living in. So it's very nakedly clear what kind of society we live in and what kind of people we are. And we have the opportunity to make profound changes. As for public health, fund it, give a great deal of attention to developing vaccines, especially a universal vaccine for influenza. But we're going to be facing lots of new viruses. There are trillions of viruses, and we only know of about 6 or 7 that are dangerous to humanity, but many of those are brand new. And we're going to be seeing more and more of them in our future. If we're not prepared for it, we'll be in trouble. But we could also look back and say that we're in some ways kind of grateful for COVID-19, that it gave us the opportunity to rebuild our health system and make our society more secure and compassionate. And that would be a great turn of events.
Larry, I deeply share that hope that, just as we responded to the Great Depression with Social Security, ultimately with the GI Bill of Rights, with measures that did really attempt to build a stronger society, that that we may do the same this time as well. But and I wonder what what elements of that restructuring you would like to see this time around.
Well, let's start with the federal government needs to be more accountable and coordinated. And the partisanship is really standing in the way of us making any kind of progress. I think that, if there's one thing that is overriding my disappointment with our country right now is that here we are in distress and we're still in this culture war, which is totally pointless. This is, I think we have to step beyond that and acknowledge that this is a country in distress, and we need to address it seriously. If we can get the partisanship tamed down, I'm not naive enough to think it'll ever go away. But if we can at least get to the point where everybody's thinking of the common national interest, then I think we can begin to focus on the structural problems that we need to make.
And I mean, vis-a-vis that cultural clash and that polarization, Susan asks, how do you respond to those people who claim that their constitutional rights are being infringed on when they're required to wear masks and the like? And maybe just to frame it in a broader sense, you do see in opinion polls that to be a Democrat in America today is to perceive that the coronavirus is threatening, is deadly. And in parts of the country, at least, to be a Republican is to feel that the threat is exaggerated, that it's being used to take down the president, and so that our responses to a bit of RNA, called the virus, is actually, happens through this prism of our political ideology. And it always struck me that after the 2009 swine flu, that initially Democrats and Republicans were equally concerned, as would make sense. And then because it began to take on political coloring, so Democrats became 50% more likely to get vaccinated. And I just kind of despair when even our encounters with viruses are absorbed through this prism of ideology and suspicion.
Well, unfortunately, a profound example of that just happened today when the vice president walked into Mayo Clinic without a mask, where everybody's required to have one. He goes into a ward where the patients are there with masks. Everybody has a mask. And what does that demonstrate? I mean, there are many things that is a signal, but it's certainly a partisan signal. And it's also a way of deprecating the seriousness of the enterprise that those doctors are engaged in. And I take umbrage at that. I think it's offensive and damaging to our national sense of unity. And that's the kind of thing I think we have to put a stop to.
Well, if the vice president is watching, then
he'll take it from me, right?
Scott asks, he says, does your book deal with a vaccine? And what more can we do to create a vaccine?
Well, one of the great things about this book is I got to interview all these experts who are now, some of them, working on vaccines to try to eliminate this COVID-19. But I studied the history of vaccination from the very beginning. Is a fascinating history. And then I had a problem. I had my hero, and he had to kind of solve the problem. And I created this terrible problem for him, but I had no idea how to solve it.
Oh,
and
is that right?
So, yeah, I mean, I painted myself into a corner. And so I called my experts and I said, here's the problem. Here he is, and he's got this, and he's got this, and they loved it. I mean, essentially, these are puzzle workers. These are guys who love a mystery. And so, I give them the parameters, and I'm talking to the greatest minds in the world on vaccine. It was thrilling. They don't have time for me now. They're actually, you know, making those vaccines, but I could never have solved the problems that I created for myself with vaccines without the help of these guys.
And that it sort of goes back a little bit to Edward Jenner, I guess.
Yes, I know. It's the world should remember the name of James Phipps. When Edward Jenner, who was a country doctor in Great Britain, he stumbled on the idea that smallpox might be eliminated by inoculating people with cowpox, because milkmaids didn't get smallpox. And this was a theory. And so at the time, 400,000 people a year were dying in Europe of smallpox. And a third of those who survived were blinded. You know, just unbelievable devastation year after year after year. So we have to look at what he did in that light. But he got his gardener's son, this 8-year-old boy, James, and he took some pus from a cowpox infection of a milkmaid, and he injected it into this boy. And 6 weeks later, he injected him with smallpox. And then he did it again, and the boy did not get sick. Now, this is wholly unallowed, you know, in modern society. But if it weren't for that child, you know, smallpox might have rampaged on for decades more. But, you know, there are many episodes like that in the history of medicine and epidemiology that I find totally captivating.
I read somewhere that I think that Edward Jenner and Napoleon lived roughly contemporaneously, and that in their lives, Jenner saved approximately as many lives as Napoleon lost. And of course, Napoleon is well known, and there are statues of him all over the world. And there's, I think, one bust of Edward Jenner in England somewhere. And, you know, but otherwise, it's kind of maybe the lesson is become a general, don't become an epidemiologist.
Well, in this case, General Napoleon could have done a little better on the disease front. When he marched on Moscow, he was besieged by dysentery, and then on the way back, typhus. And he took an army of 500,000 men. And by the time that he got back to France, there were fewer than 10,000. That was the toll that disease took on the great army.
We have a question from Mara about your thoughts on the virus and its effects on the Middle East. And, you know, so in your book, you certainly describe issues of civil unrest in various countries. And I wonder whether you think that is an issue in some of these countries that are seem domestically somewhat fragile, and also about international conflicts. You know, may there be a search for scapegoats that leads to conflict across borders? Yes,
I think, you know, these are the Middle East is shaped by weak countries and autocrats. You know, there doesn't seem to be a middle ground, and the weak countries, this will cause more social chaos, and chaos invites terrorism. Even right now, ISIS is trying to, you know, develop a medical arm so that they can be seen as a more responsible party than the governments, which is not hard to do in some countries. And then in the autocratic states, there'll be people that resent the impositions on freedom, and they'll make them feel more resentful against their government than they do already. So it's a stressor in every country, but especially in the Middle East.
One of the things that kind of amused me about the novel was the degree to which you used some real names, real people. You had Richard Clarke, who was a prominent counterterrorism official in the Bush administration, plays a role, and then you managed to knock off Taylor Swift and several other people. I wondered what your calculations were about using real names like that.
Well, it's, you know, first of all, I couldn't make up a better character than Dick Clark, so I just used him as a character, and he was fine with that. But the business of my assassinating certain celebrities in my book, sometimes as markers, we look at how serious this is according to who dies, and we live in a culture in which celebrities are those kinds of markers. And it's been interesting in this particular episode. There have only been a handful of really notable household names. But in the novel, which foresees a far more dangerous disease, you would have a harvesting of very notable people. And also in the novel, since the flu is like the 1918 flu, it strikes people in middle age, the fit, the robust people whose own immune systems are what kill them.
Well, I hope Taylor Swift doesn't come after you in her next album.
She can hold a grudge, I gotta say that.
I'm not even going to mention that for fear I get a mention. Let's see, there are some more questions. John asks about social media, which is something that doesn't exactly come up that I can remember, but it is certainly very much a part of how antagonisms play out today. Does social media make it more difficult for scientists to combat a virus?
Yeah, the way that I address that in this is disinformation propaganda, which is a subject I deal with in the novel. And we see this happening right now, especially from Russia. It's the war on science and the undermining of American resolve and so on. It's scandalous, but it actually has an effect. It seems dismaying to me that as a country we're so pliant and easily moved by such absurd propaganda. But I actually employ that in the novel because I think it's very meaningful. And there's an analog, the computer virus, which also plays a role in the novel, because that's another thing that we're dealing with, is constant assault. Right now is at a low level of conflict, but it's damaging. And just our elections, for instance, at risk. Those kinds of meddling, that we've been facing, that plays a role in the book as well, because I see it as the kind of virtual analog of the viruses that we deal with in real life.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, cyber is something. I mean, I worry about pandemics, but I also worry about cyber attacks. And so, indeed, as you say, your book has a major cyber attack. And one of the striking things about both cyber attacks and bioterrorism is that attribution is not always easy.
Right.
And that can make them useful for either terrorists or for nation states, but it also makes it very difficult for a country to defend against and to create disincentives, to create deterrence. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's frustrating because, how do you respond to cyber attacks where you're not really sure where they come from? I think this is wrecking society in many ways. The breeding distrust, undermining authority. It's made, and it's also done something. It's harmed the internet, which I feel very personal about this. I think the internet is one of the greatest creations that humanity ever came up with. To have instant knowledge instantly at hand, it's just amazing. It's beautiful, and just from an aesthetic point of view, I dislike the way that it's been harmed and made into an agency of lies and propaganda.
You've, you're an author, but you're also a journalist, and your career has spanned a period in which a lot of journalism, especially local journalism, is kind of in crisis, and the pandemic has actually magnified it. It has made it, I mean, a lot of local papers around the country are now going under. I wonder, as you know, an alum of some of those kinds of news organizations, whether you think this also undermines the, not exactly the social fabric, but the, you know, the civil society of the country.
I absolutely. When I talk about civilization collapsing, what actually happens, I think, is that it thins out like ice. It looks like it's solid, but then when you apply pressure to it, it cracks. And I think that's where we are now, and the weakness of our press now, and getting worse and worse, is a big factor in the thinning of the ice of civilization. And
What do you mean?
We don't have truth readily at hand. We don't have the authority. It's probably less noticeable at a national level than it is at local levels, because local newspapers are really, really suffering, and so the ability to hold people or institutions or your government accountable declines with every lost reporter, and every newspaper that goes down. There's less and less accountability, and therefore civil society diminishes. And we can't take too much of that before we really suffer a major loss of standing in our civil society.
Antonio asks about your writing process and how it differs when you're working on fiction versus nonfiction.
Well, there are things that are, first of all, I write in many forms, as you pointed out earlier, but I think it's all storytelling. Basically, I'm trying to tell a story. It might be as a movie or a play or a novel or a nonfiction book or a New Yorker article. But in some ways, the process is similar. I use note cards. I'm kind of a fanatic on that. And, note cards help me sort out the facts and keep them in mind, because honestly, I have not a very good memory. So I like to write down things, and then I file them. And when I file them, I'm in a way organizing. When I'm writing a movie or a play or a novel, I will write out scene ideas and just throw them in a pile. And when the pile gets this high, I start. If it's a play, I'll lay it out in 2 acts, and if it's a movie, I'll put it in 3 acts, and then chapters if it's a book. But I try to close the door, be totally silent, and just envision how the flow of the story goes. And so in that way, they're similar. Nonfiction books are more complex, but they, once again, I rely on the note cards to be a repository of information, and then the classification of that information is really, in a subliminal way, the outline. Once I've found what I'm interested in, what I'm going to write about, I have the book pretty much in mind.
You mentioned, and so you use these note cards for fiction as well. So this novel, it, like a lot of those scientific tidbits that are scattered throughout, those started out on a note card?
I also, when I get stuck on something, I'll often go for a run, and I'll take note cards with me. And people have seen me stopping, on the trail, and with a pen in my hand, writing notes to myself on my note cards. I know it is really primitive, not at all virtual in any modern way, but it just helps me have the information readily at hand. I think that it's the problem is that, and nobody does what I suggest. I think the sole practitioner, because it's front end loaded. There's a lot of labor in front, but once you've done that, it's a lot easier to write. And I think that you get momentum that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I don't know if this is really true, but I operate on the principle that it is true. that the momentum with which you write carries over in the speed with which the reader is able to go through it and feel that propulsion. So that's what I'm after when I'm doing that.
I likewise get good ideas for, for columns or articles or a book chapter when I'm out running, but I don't have a pen or note card. Maybe I'll have to.
Well, how do you retain those thoughts, Nick?
I'm sorry?
How do you retain those thoughts?
I just, with great determination, I make sure I remember it until I get home and then scroll it down. And you're in some kind of a book-lined room. Is that where the writing actually happens?
Oh yeah, this is my office, and it's a nice office. My editor, David Rimnick, calls it writer porn, and it is. I love working in here, and my life really hasn't changed as much as many people's because I write at home. I live at home. I don't go out that much, and so quarantine is not so different from ordinary life for me.
We're almost out of time, but you said something that it surprised me about having gotten your hero, in this pickle, and then you didn't have a way to get him to solve the problem. I don't want to quite say what it is for fear of giving things away, but so when you begin the novel, or when you're, do you not have the plotting kind of pretty clearly worked out all the way through?
Well, I have a general idea of where it's going, and the steps along the way, and then I'm hoping that I can figure out the science that goes along with it. And the problem that I was referencing had to do with vaccination, and it's an abstruse and difficult to comprehend subject, but I had to make it vivid and exciting for the reader, and so it gives me the opportunity to fill in some of the history of vaccination. What has been tried, as my character is trying to figure out how, in this circumstance that he's in, which is very straitened, what have scientists in the past done? 19th century Paris, or how did they deal with the diseases of their era when they didn't have modern science and they didn't have electron microscopes and so on? What did they do then? And so it was a great opportunity to kind of rehearse the history of this science inside the mind of a character who's trying to solve a very difficult problem.
Well, one last thing, and then we can turn it, back over to John. But you've written a wonderful book. It's a great page turner, as well as very informative about the kind of challenges that the world faces right now. But I wonder about the message that you want people to take away when they put it down. It's an engrossing story about a family, but you're also making a point and transmitting a message. What is that when people finish it and put it down? What do you want them to be thinking?
I guess the message is we're in danger. And, we don't take our society and our civilization seriously enough to preserve it. It's very precious. We're fortunate as journalists to be able to go out in the world and see other societies and other countries and how they structure their societies. I don't know how it is for you, but sometimes when I get on the plane and I've got that American passport in my hand and I can leave, and so many of the people that I talk to are trapped. They'll never have the futures that they might have had if they had the freedom and education that I had been given. This is so precious, so precious. And I see it all at risk. And so, yeah, if there's despair in the book, it does reflect some of the anxiety that I feel. And I didn't feel like making it a rosy ending, because I think it's, we're living in an increasingly dysfunctional society. And I hope that, as a warning, the book will serve a purpose. And I hope that the disease that we're struggling with now will serve the same purpose.
Well, thank you. we both studied at the American University in Cairo. So in good Cairo dialect, I should say, shukran gazilan.
Yeah, Afwan, yeah, habibi. And Nick, I want to say, just since you didn't say it, Nick has written a wonderful book with his wife, Tightrope, about the problems of America, all embodied in the people you grew up with in this little town in Oregon. It's amazing how you can create a mirror on American society just out of that one small society. So anyway, I want to congratulate you on that and say that it's a really wonderful read.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was very much from the heart. It was the kids on my old school bus, and we choose different platforms to try to tell a larger story. In this case, the pandemic through a novel. In my case, the strains on the U.S. through the prism of the kids on the old number 6 school bus in Yamhill, Oregon.
Yeah. Well, congratulations.
Thank you, and congratulations to you. And we'll invite John to finish it off.
I just want to say thank you to Lawrence Wright. Thank you to Nicholas Kristof. This has been such an interesting conversation, and congrats to you both on your books. Thank you to Christina and everyone at Book People in Austin for hosting this event. And thank you to everyone watching. You've been a great audience, submitted some great questions. Just as a reminder, the books that you all ordered as part of tonight's event are on the way, and you can find the catalogs of both tonight's speakers and much more at Book People's website, bookpeople.com. So thanks, everyone. Have a good night, and so long.
Bye.
Bye.